The $20 million contract lay spread across mahogany, each page worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. Silas Cade's platinum Rolex caught the chandelier light as he reached for his Mont Blanc pen, the weight of power settling around him like expensive cologne. Foreign investors held their breath. Security stood at attention. Everything was calculated to the second. Then she appeared. A 5-year-old girl with dirt-streaked cheeks and a wrinkled yellow dress, moving through the private salon like a ghost. She shouldn't have been there. Couldn't have been there. The Fairmont Olympics penthouse suite was locked down tighter than Fort Knox. Yet somehow this child had slipped past million-dollar security systems and armed guards. Silas froze as small hands gripped his white dress shirt, the top 4 buttons undone as always, revealing the discreet tattoo on the side of his neck. The room held its collective breath as the little girl climbed onto his leather chair with the determination of someone who had nothing left to lose. Her mouth found his ear, and 3 words shattered his carefully constructed world. They took my mum. Welcome to Passion and Power, where dangerous love stories unfold in the shadows of power. If you're ready for a tale that will grip your heart and never let go, comment below where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button. Your support means everything to us, and trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next in this incredible journey. 6 hours earlier, Silas Cade had been untouchable. The morning sun cast long shadows across his corner office on the 42nd floor of the Columbia Center, Seattle's skyline spreading beneath him like a kingdom he'd carved from concrete and blood. His empire stretched from the docks of Elliott Bay to the tech corridors of South Lake Union, invisible threads of influence connecting legitimate businesses to the underground networks that truly ran the city. At 42, Silas commanded respect through calculated silence and surgical precision. His Italian heritage showed in the sharp angles of his face, the way he wore power like a second skin, and the gold cross that hung against his chest, a contradiction he'd never bothered to resolve. The white dress shirt, always unbuttoned just enough to hint at the strength beneath, had become his signature. Today's meeting would cement his position as the undisputed king of the West Coast. "The Koreans are nervous," Davy reported, adjusting his earpiece as he scanned the street below. Silas's head of security had been with him for 8 years, long enough to read the subtle shifts in his boss's expression. "They want additional guarantees about the shipping routes." Silas checked his Rolex, a habit that had become unconscious over the years. They'll get their guarantees when they see the numbers. 20 million doesn't buy hesitation. The Fairmont Olympic Hotel's penthouse suite had been chosen for its discretion and security. Foreign investors preferred neutral ground, and Silas preferred controlling every variable. The contract would legitimize 3 new shipping routes through Puget Sound, routes that would carry more than the electronics and luxury goods listed on the manifests. By 3 o'clock, the suite buzzed with quiet tension. Men in expensive suits spoke in measured tones, while security personnel maintained invisible perimeters. Silas took his position at the head of the mahogany table, the contract's pages spread before him like a map to a new territory. The Korean delegation leader, Mr. Park, nodded respectfully. "Mr. Cade, we appreciate your thoroughness in these arrangements." "Thoroughness keeps everyone profitable," Silas replied, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "and alive." A nervous chuckle rippled through the room. These men understood the language of power, even if they preferred to dress it in corporate euphemisms. Silas reached for his Mont Blanc pen, the platinum catching the afternoon light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. That's when she appeared. The little girl moved through the room like smoke, her presence so unexpected that for a moment everyone assumed she belonged to someone else. She was perhaps 5 years old, with tangled brown hair and a yellow dress that had seen better days. Dirt streaked her cheeks, and her eyes held a hollowness that didn't belong on a child's face. Security froze, hands moving instinctively toward concealed weapons before stopping. How did you draw on a kindergartner? How had she even gotten past the checkpoints? Silas watched her approach with the same analytical calm he applied to hostile negotiations. The child's movements were purposeful, not random. She wasn't lost or confused. She was hunting. When she reached his chair, she didn't hesitate. Small hands gripped the leather armrests as she climbed up, her determination absolute. Silas found himself holding perfectly still as she settled beside him, her weight barely registering. The room had gone silent. 23 adults, including some of the most dangerous men on the West Coast, watched a 5-year-old take control of their meeting. She leaned close to his ear, her breath warm against his skin. "They took my mum." The words hit him like a physical blow, not because of their content, but because of their delivery, matter-of-fact, desperate and completely trusting. This child had somehow identified him as someone who could help, had navigated through layers of security to reach him, and was now placing her faith in a man who'd built his fortune on calculated violence. "Please," she whispered, her small hand finding his. "Help. They took her." Silas felt something shift inside his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in decades. The last time someone had asked him for help, really asked, with everything on the line, he'd been too young and too weak to provide it. That failure had shaped every decision since. He looked down at the child, taking in details with professional precision. The dirt under her fingernails suggested she'd been hiding outside. The wrinkles in her dress indicated she'd slept in it. The redness around her eyes spoke of tears shed in silence. "What's your name?" he asked quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "Marley," she whispered back. "Marley Rowan." The surname meant nothing to him, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the way she looked at him, not with fear, despite his reputation, but with the desperate hope of someone who had nowhere else to turn. Around the table, investors shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't part of the plan. Children didn't belong in their world of shadows and silent agreements. Silas made a decision that would change everything. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "we'll reconvene tomorrow. Something more important has come up." The investors filed out with barely concealed frustration, $20 million walking away in Italian leather shoes. Silas didn't care. He'd built his empire by recognizing when the game changed, and this 5-year-old had just rewritten all the rules. "Boss," Davy approached cautiously, his hand resting on his concealed weapon. "Security wants to know how she got past the checkpoints." "Find out," Silas ordered, then looked down at Marley, who hadn't moved from his chair. "But carefully. She's not a threat." Marley studied him with the intensity of someone far older than 5. Her eyes, he noticed, were the color of storm clouds, gray with flecks of blue that seemed to shift with her emotions. She'd stopped crying, but her grip on his hand remained firm. "Where did they take your mom?" he asked, settling back in his chair to put them at eye level. "Bad men came to the restaurant," Marley said, her voice small but steady. "Mama was closing up. I was supposed to be sleeping in the back room, but I heard yelling." Silas felt his jaw tighten. "What restaurant?" "Bella Vista, on Pine Street." She paused, then added with heartbreaking precision, "They had guns." Bella Vista. Silas knew it well, a small Italian place that served as a front for money laundering operations. Not his operation, but he kept tabs on every business in his territory. If someone was making moves there, it was either stupidity or a declaration of war. "Did you see the men who took her?" Marley nodded, then surprised him by reaching into her dress pocket. She pulled out a crumpled business card, the edges worn from small fingers. "One of them dropped this. I followed the car here." Silas took the card, his blood turning to ice as he read the name, Vale Industries, Soren Vale's legitimate front company, the same Soren Vale who'd been testing boundaries for months, pushing into territories that belonged to Silas. "You followed them here?" he asked, impressed despite himself. "How?" "I ran," Marley said simply. "Mama always says if something bad happens, find someone who looks important and ask for help. You look important." The logic was sound, if terrifying. This child had witnessed her mother's kidnapping, escaped on her own, and tracked the perpetrators across downtown Seattle, all while most kids her age were learning to tie their shoes. Angelica, the hotel's head of guest services, appeared at his elbow. She'd been coordinating with his security team for months, ensuring their meetings remained undisturbed. Now she looked genuinely shaken. "Mr. Cade, I'm so sorry. We have no idea how she got past security. The cameras show her entering through the service elevator, but there's no record of her accessing any restricted areas." Service elevator? Silas looked at Marley with new respect. You came up through the kitchen? I hid in a laundry cart, Marley admitted. Then I followed the man with the card. He came to this floor. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. This 5-year-old had accomplished what trained assassins would struggle with, infiltrating a secured location through pure determination and childlike invisibility. Boss, Davy returned, his expression grim. I've got bad news. Bella Vista was hit last night around 11 p.m. Local PD has it listed as a robbery gone wrong, but the scene doesn't match. Too clean, too professional. Witnesses? None willing to talk, but I found something interesting. Davy glanced at Marley, then continued carefully. The restaurant's been laundering money for the Kozlov operation out of Portland. If Vale's people hit it, they weren't just grabbing one waitress. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Soren Vale wasn't just expanding his territory, he was systematically dismantling the financial networks that kept Silas's empire running. The kidnapping wasn't random violence, it was strategic warfare. And somehow, this little girl had become the key to understanding his enemy's plan. Marley, Silas said gently, I need you to think very carefully. Did the men say anything about why they took your mum? She scrunched her face in concentration. One of them said something about sending a message, and they kept asking Mama about numbers. She kept saying she didn't know any numbers. Financial codes, account information. The Kozlov operation used Bella Vista's staff to move encrypted data along with the cash. If Vale's people were torturing restaurant workers for information, they were building a comprehensive picture of Silas's financial infrastructure. We need to move, Silas decided, standing abruptly. Marley slid down from the chair but kept hold of his hand, her small fingers surprisingly strong. Where are we going? She asked. Somewhere safe, he replied, then caught himself. When had he started thinking in terms of we? This child wasn't his responsibility. She was a witness, a source of information, nothing more. But as they walked toward the elevator, her hand trustingly in his, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that everything had just changed. For the first time in 20 years, someone was depending on him not for money or power or fear, but for simple human protection. And despite every instinct screaming that emotional attachments were weaknesses to be eliminated, he found himself tightening his grip on her small hand. The war with Soren Vale had just become personal. Silas's penthouse overlooked Elliott Bay from the 38th floor, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of the city he controlled. The space was a study in controlled luxury, Italian leather, brushed steel, and carefully curated art that spoke of wealth without ostentation. It was also a fortress, with security systems that cost more than most people's houses. Marley stood at the window, her small frame dwarfed by the expanse of glass and sky. She hadn't spoken during the drive, but her eyes had tracked every detail of their route with the intensity of someone who'd learned that survival depended on remembering escape paths. Are you hungry? Silas asked, the question feeling foreign on his tongue. When was the last time he'd concerned himself with someone else's basic needs? She nodded without turning around. Mama was supposed to make pancakes this morning. She always makes pancakes on Sundays. The casual mention of routine, of a normal life that had been shattered 12 hours ago, hit him unexpectedly. Silas was accustomed to violence, to the calculated destruction of enemies and obstacles, but this child's loss felt different, more immediate. He called down to the building's concierge, arranging for food to be delivered. As he spoke, he watched Marley in the window's reflection. She wasn't crying, wasn't throwing the tantrum he might have expected. Instead, she was studying the city below with the same analytical intensity he applied to potential threats. Marley, he said after ending the call, I need to ask you some more questions about last night. Can you do that? She turned, her storm-grey eyes meeting his directly. Will it help find Mama? Yes. Then ask. Her directness reminded him of himself at that age, before he'd learned to wrap truth in layers of diplomacy and threat. There was something refreshing about dealing with someone who hadn't yet learned to lie. The men who took your mom, did you hear any names? Marley walked to the leather sofa, climbing up to sit cross-legged. The tall one called the other one Jake, and Jake kept saying they needed to hurry because the boss was waiting. Jake. Silas ran through his mental database of Vale's known associates, but the name could belong to anyone. More concerning was the mention of a waiting boss. It suggested this wasn't a spontaneous grab, but part of a larger operation. "Did they hurt her?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle despite the rage building in his chest. "They grabbed her arms really tight. She told them she didn't know anything, but they didn't believe her." Marley's voice remained steady, but her hands twisted in her lap. "That's when I hid under the prep table. Mama always said if bad things happen, hide first, then find help." Smart woman, Silas thought. Tessa Rowan had prepared her daughter for exactly this scenario, which suggested she'd known the restaurant was more than it appeared. His phone buzzed with a text from Davy. "Found something. Vale's people hit 3 other businesses last night, all connected to Kozlov money. This is bigger than we thought." Silas stepped away to take the call, but Marley's voice stopped him. "You're going to help, right?" she asked, and for the first time he heard uncertainty creep into her tone. "You're not going to leave me like the police did?" "The police? I tried to tell them about the bad men, but they said I was confused. That Mama probably just went somewhere and forgot to tell me." Her small hands clenched into fists. "But Mama would never leave me. Never." The casual dismissal of a child's testimony didn't surprise Silas. He'd seen how the system failed people who couldn't afford better protection. But the way Marley's voice broke slightly on the word never triggered something protective in him, something he'd thought he'd buried years ago. "I'm not the police," he said, returning to sit across from her, "and I don't leave people behind." The words surprised him as much as they seemed to comfort her. When had he started making promises to 5-year-olds? His phone rang. Tony, his driver and occasional enforcer. "Boss, we've got movement. Vale's people just hit the warehouse on Harbor Island. They're not just gathering information anymore, they're taking territory." Silas felt his jaw clench. Harbor Island was the heart of his shipping operations, the nexus where legitimate cargo mixed with more profitable imports. If Vale was making moves there, he wasn't just declaring war, he was trying to cripple Silas's entire operation in one coordinated strike. "How many casualties?" he asked. 3 of ours down, but they'll live. Vale's people were professional, in and out, minimal violence." They were looking for something specific. The shipping manifests, Silas realized. With the financial codes from Bella Vista and the shipping schedules from Harbor Island, Vale would have everything he needed to intercept Silas's most valuable cargo. As he processed the implications, Marley appeared at his elbow. She'd moved silently across the room. Another skill that spoke of hard-learned survival instincts. "The bad men are still doing bad things," she said, having clearly overheard enough to understand the situation. "Yes," he admitted. There was no point in lying to someone who'd already seen too much. "Then we need to stop them." She said it with the simple logic of childhood, as if the solution was obvious. "It's not that easy." "Why not?" Marley interrupted, her grey eyes flashing with sudden fire. "They took Mama. They're hurting other people. You have guns and cars and people who listen to you. Why can't you just go get her?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Why couldn't he? He had the resources, the manpower, the motivation. What was stopping him from turning Seattle upside down until he found Tessa Rowan? The answer came to him with uncomfortable clarity. Because he'd spent so many years calculating risks and minimizing exposure that he'd forgotten how to act on simple moral imperatives. This child was asking him to be a hero, and he wasn't sure he remembered how. But as he looked into her eyes that held too much pain for someone so young, Silas felt something shift in his chest, a decision crystallizing that had nothing to do with business or territory or strategic advantage. "You're right," he said finally. "We're going to get your mom back." For the first time since she'd climbed into his chair, Marley smiled. It transformed her entire face, revealing the child she should have been allowed to remain. "Promise?" she asked. "Promise," Silas replied, and meant it completely. He just hoped he could keep it. The abandoned warehouse in Georgetown had been Silas's interrogation site for 3 years, soundproof, isolated, and equipped with everything necessary to extract information from unwilling subjects. Tonight, it would serve a different purpose. Jake Morrison sat zip-tied to a metal chair, blood trickling from his split lip where Davy had encouraged him to be more talkative. He was one of Vale's mid-level enforcers, grabbed during a routine collection run in Pioneer Square. Not important enough to start a war over, but valuable enough to know details about recent operations. "I'm going to ask you one more time," Silas said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Where is Tessa Rowan?" Jake spat blood onto the concrete floor. "Go to hell, Cade. You think you run this city, but Vale's about to show you different." Silas checked his Rolex, a habit that had become more pronounced since Marley had entered his life. It was past midnight, which meant Tessa had been missing for over 24 hours. Every minute increased the chances that she was already dead. "Davy," he said quietly, "show Mr. Morrison what happens to people who waste my time." Before Davy could move, Silas's phone buzzed with an urgent text from Tony. "Problem at the penthouse. Get back here now." Ice flooded Silas's veins. He'd left Marley with 2 guards and explicit instructions that she wasn't to leave the building under any circumstances. If something had happened to her while he was trying to save her mother. "Keep him alive," he ordered Davy, already moving toward the exit. "I'll be back." The drive to his building took 12 minutes that felt like hours. Silas's mind raced through possibilities, each worse than the last. Vale could have tracked them. The building's security could have been compromised. Marley could have tried to leave on her own. He found his penthouse in chaos, furniture overturned, windows shattered, and his 2 guards unconscious but breathing. Tony stood in the center of the destruction, his face grim. "They took her," Tony reported. "Professional job, in and out in under 3 minutes. Left this." He handed Silas a single sheet of paper with an address and a time, Pier 70. 2 a.m. Come alone, or both the woman and the child die. Silas stared at the note, feeling something cold and deadly settle in his chest. Vale had made this personal by taking Marley. That was a mistake that would cost him everything. "How many men do we have available?" he asked. 12 plus the crew from Harbor Island, but boss, if you go in there—" "I'm not negotiating," Silas cut him off. "Vale wants to play games with a 5-year-old. He's about to learn why that was the worst decision of his life." Pier 70 jutted into Elliott Bay like a concrete finger, its abandoned warehouses and rusted cranes creating perfect cover for the kind of meeting that left bodies floating in the Sound. Silas arrived 15 minutes early, his team positioned at strategic points around the perimeter. He'd ignored the instruction to come alone. Some rules were made to be broken. The warehouse at the pier's end glowed with harsh fluorescent light. As Silas approached, he could see figures moving inside. His earpiece crackled with updates from his men, but his focus remained fixed on the building ahead. Soren Vale stood in the center of the warehouse, a thin man in his 50s whose expensive suit couldn't disguise the predator underneath. He smiled as Silas entered, the expression never reaching his pale blue eyes. "Silas Cade," Vale said, his voice carrying a slight accent that spoke of Eastern European origins. "So good of you to accept my invitation." "Where are they?" Silas demanded, his hand resting casually near his concealed Glock. "Safe," Vale replied, "for now, but I'm afraid their continued well-being depends entirely on your cooperation." 2 of Vale's men emerged from the shadows, dragging Tessa Rowan between them. She was alive but clearly injured, her face bruised and her movements unsteady. Behind them, another enforcer held Marley, the child's eyes wide with fear but still defiant. "Mama!" Marley called out, struggling against her captor's grip. The sound of the child's voice triggered something primal in Silas. He'd spent 20 years building walls around his emotions, but seeing Marley afraid and helpless shattered every barrier he'd constructed. "Let them go," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "Your fight is with me." "Oh, but that's where you're wrong," Vale replied, beginning to pace. "My fight is with everything you've built, your territory, your operations, your reputation. And the fastest way to destroy a man like you is to show the world that you can't protect the people who trust you. What do you want? Complete withdrawal from the shipping routes, transfer of all Harbor Island operations, and a public acknowledgement that the West Coast belongs to me now." Vale's smile widened. "In exchange, I'll let you keep your life. The woman and child, however, have seen too much." Silas felt his world narrow to a single point of absolute clarity. Vale was going to kill Tessa and Marley regardless of what he agreed to. This wasn't a negotiation. It was an execution disguised as a business meeting. "You made one mistake," Silas said, his voice carrying across the warehouse. "And what's that?" "You hurt a child." The words were a signal. Windows exploded inward as Silas's men breached the warehouse from 3 directions. Gunfire erupted, muzzle flashes strobing in the fluorescent light. Vale's men scrambled for cover, but they'd been caught completely off guard. In the chaos, Silas moved with lethal precision. His first shot dropped the enforcer holding Marley. His second put Vale's lieutenant on the ground permanently. By the time the shooting stopped, only Vale himself remained alive, cowering behind an overturned table. Silas walked slowly across the warehouse, his footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. Vale looked up at him with the desperate eyes of a man who'd finally realized he'd miscalculated. "Please," Vale whispered, "we can make a deal." "The deal was simple," Silas replied, raising his weapon. "Don't touch what's mine." The single gunshot echoed across the water. 3 days later, Silas sat in his office watching the sunrise paint Seattle's skyline in shades of gold and crimson. The city looked the same as always, but everything had changed. Vale's organization had crumbled within hours of their leader's death, his lieutenants either dead or fleeing to other territories. The shipping routes were secure, the financial networks intact, and Silas's reputation had grown even more fearsome. None of that mattered as much as the small hand that slipped into his. "Good morning," Marley said, climbing into the chair beside his desk. She'd been staying at his penthouse since the rescue, sleeping in the guest room while social services tried to figure out what to do with her. Her mother was recovering in a private hospital, her injuries serious but not life-threatening. "Good morning," Silas replied, still amazed by how natural this felt. "How did you sleep?" "Better," she admitted. "I didn't have the scary dreams. The nightmares had started the day after the warehouse. Marley would wake up screaming, and somehow Silas had become the only person who could calm her down. He'd sit by her bed, reading stories or just talking until she fell back asleep, his presence the only thing that made her feel safe. "Mama's coming home today," Marley announced, her grey eyes bright with excitement. "I know." Silas had arranged for Tessa's release from the hospital, along with a new apartment in a secure building and a job that didn't involve money laundering. It was the least he could do for the woman whose daughter had changed his life. "Will you come with us?" Marley asked, and something in her voice made him look at her more carefully. "To see your mom, of course." "No," she said patiently. "Will you come home with us, to our new place?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications Silas wasn't sure he was ready to face. This child was asking him to be part of her family, to abandon the careful isolation he'd maintained for decades. "Marley," he began carefully, "my life is very different from yours. I do things that—" "I know what you do," she interrupted, her voice matter-of-fact. "You hurt bad people so they can't hurt good people, like you saved me and Mama." The simple clarity of her understanding left him speechless. In her 5-year-old logic, he wasn't a criminal or a killer. He was a protector, someone who used his power to keep families safe. "It's more complicated than that," he tried to explain. "Why?" she asked, tilting her head. "You're not a bad person. Bad people don't read bedtime stories, or make sure little girls eat their vegetables, or stay up all night when someone has scary dreams." Each observation hit him like a physical blow. When had he started doing those things? When had caring for this child become as natural as breathing? "Besides," Marley continued, "Mama likes you." "She does?" "She told me yesterday. She said you're the first person who ever kept a promise to her." Marley's expression grew serious. "She also said you look sad when you think no one's watching." The observation was uncomfortably accurate. Silas had spent so many years building walls that he'd forgotten what it felt like to let someone see past them. But somehow, this 5-year-old and her mother had slipped through every defense he'd constructed. His phone buzzed with a text from Davy. "Tessa Rowan is ready for discharge. Car is waiting downstairs." "Time to go," Silas said, standing and offering Marley his hand. She took it without hesitation, her small fingers intertwining with his. "You didn't answer my question." "Which question?" Will you come home with us? Silas looked down at her, this remarkable child who'd walked into his life and turned everything upside down. She was asking him to choose between the isolation that had kept him safe and the vulnerability that came with caring about other people. It wasn't really a choice at all. Yes, he said quietly. I'll come home with you. Marley's smile could have powered the entire city. Good, because families are supposed to stay together. Families. The word felt foreign and familiar at the same time, like a language he'd once known, but had forgotten how to speak. As they walked toward the elevator, Marley chattering about all the things she wanted to show him in their new apartment, Silas realized that for the first time in 20 years, he wasn't afraid of the future. He was looking forward to it. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and hope. Tessa Rowan sat on the edge of her bed, dressed in clothes Silas had arranged to be delivered, simple jeans and a sweater, that made her look younger than her 28 years. The bruises on her face were fading, but her eyes still held the wariness of someone who'd seen too much. "Mama!" Marley launched herself into her mother's arms, and Silas felt his chest tighten at the reunion. This was what he'd been fighting for, not territory or money or respect, but the simple right of a mother and daughter to be together. "Baby girl," Tessa whispered, holding Marley close. "I missed you so much." "I missed you too, but Silas took care of me. He reads really good bedtime stories, and he makes pancakes almost as good as yours." Tessa looked up at him over Marley's head, her expression unreadable. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." "You don't need to thank me," Silas replied, meaning it completely. "Yes, I do." Tessa's voice was firm. "You saved our lives. You gave us a future. That's not something I'll ever forget." They drove through Seattle in comfortable silence, Marley pointing out landmarks from her position between them in the back seat. The new apartment was in Belltown, close enough to downtown for Tessa's new job, but far enough from the restaurant district to feel safe. Silas had chosen it carefully, prioritizing security and normalcy in equal measure. "It's beautiful," Tessa breathed as they entered the furnished two-bedroom space. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of the Sound, and the kitchen was equipped with everything a mother would need to make pancakes on Sunday mornings. "My room has a window seat," Marley announced, racing to explore every corner of their new home. Tessa turned to Silas, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "This is too much, I can't possibly—" "You can," he interrupted gently, "and you will. Because that little girl deserves a safe place to grow up, and you deserve a chance to give it to her." "What about you?" she asked quietly. "What do you deserve?" The question caught him off guard. What did he deserve? For 20 years, he'd measured his worth in fear and respect, in the size of his territory and the loyalty of his men. But standing in this apartment, watching Marley explore her new room while her mother looked at him with something that might have been affection, Silas realized he'd been asking the wrong question. It wasn't about what he deserved, it was about what he wanted. And what he wanted was this: a family, a home, a reason to build something instead of just protecting what he'd already taken. "I deserve whatever you're willing to give me," he said finally. Tessa stepped closer, her hand finding his. "Then stay," she whispered. "Stay and help me give our daughter the life she deserves. Our daughter." The words hit him like a revelation. Somewhere in the past week, Marley had stopped being a responsibility and started being family. And Tessa had become something he'd never thought he'd find. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "I've never been more sure of anything," she replied, rising on her toes to kiss him softly. From the bedroom came Marley's voice. "Are you guys being mushy? Because I want to show Silas my new room." They broke apart laughing, and Silas felt something settle in his chest, a peace he'd never known he was searching for. "Coming, sweetheart," he called back, and the word felt as natural as breathing. As they walked toward Marley's room, Tessa's hand in his, Silas realized that the little girl who'd climbed into his chair and whispered, "They took my mum," had given him something far more valuable than information or leverage. She'd given him a family. Years later, Silas would look back on that Sunday morning as the moment his real life began. The penthouse had been transformed into something he'd never thought possible. A home. Children's artwork covered the refrigerator. Family photos lined the mantelpiece, and the sound of laughter echoed through rooms that had once known only silence. Marley, now 8 and fierce as ever, sat at the kitchen island working on homework, while Tessa prepared their traditional Sunday pancakes. The domestic scene should have felt foreign to a man who'd built his empire on violence and fear, but instead, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "Dad," Marley said, not looking up from her math worksheet, "Tommy Henderson at school says his dad could beat up your dad. I told him that was impossible because you're my dad, and you're the strongest person in the world." Silas smiled, still amazed by how easily she'd started calling him that. The adoption papers had been finalized 6 months ago, making official what had been true from the moment she'd trusted him with her mother's life. "What did Tommy say to that?" he asked, settling beside her with his coffee. "He said prove it. So I told him about the time you carried me and Mama and all our groceries up 4 flights of stairs when the elevator was broken." She looked up at him with those storm-grey eyes that still held the power to undo him completely. "That's strong, right?" "The strongest," Tessa agreed, kissing the top of Silas's head as she set a plate of pancakes in front of him. "Strong enough to carry all of us." The business had changed too. Still profitable, still powerful, but cleaner now. Silas had gradually shifted his operations toward legitimate enterprises, using his reputation to smooth the transition rather than enforce it. He'd discovered that being feared was useful, but being respected was better. And being loved, that was everything. "I have an announcement," Marley declared, setting down her pencil with dramatic flair. "I've decided what I want to be when I grow up." "Oh?" Silas raised an eyebrow. Last week it had been a veterinarian, the week before an astronaut. "I want to help people like you helped us," she said seriously. "I want to find the bad guys and stop them from hurting families." Silas felt his chest tighten with pride and concern in equal measure. "That's a dangerous job, sweetheart." "So is yours," she pointed out with devastating logic. "But you do it because someone has to, because families need protecting." She was right, of course, she usually was. This remarkable child who'd walked into his life and changed everything had inherited his protective instincts along with his stubborn determination. "We'll see," he said diplomatically. "You've got a few years to decide." "I've already decided," Marley replied with the absolute certainty of childhood. "I'm going to be just like you." As Silas looked around the table at his family, his wife, his daughter, his entire world, he realized that the little girl who'd once whispered, "They took my mom," had grown into someone who understood that sometimes the most important thing you could do was refuse to let the bad guys win. And if she wanted to follow in his footsteps, he'd make damn sure she was ready for whatever the world threw at her. After all, that's what fathers did. They protected their children, taught them to be strong, and loved them enough to let them find their own way, even if that way led them into the same dangerous world that had brought their family together in the first place. What an incredible journey of love, protection, and family. From a desperate whisper to a beautiful new beginning, Silas and his girls proved that sometimes the most unexpected encounters change everything. Did this story touch your heart? Drop a comment below sharing your favorite moment, and don't forget to subscribe for more passionate tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Your support means the world to us here at Passion and Power. See you in the next story.